It is indeed a privilege and a pleasure to have been given the opportunity to tell some of Eric Feldt's story today. I wish to acknowledge the traditional inhabitants of this land, the Turrbal and Jagera people. I also wish to express my gratitude to all Australians and people of other nations who played a part, great or small, in the battle for Australia in World War II. Further, my thanks goes to those who helped me write my book, Right Man, Right Place, Worst Time. They were my great-grandmother, Augusta Feldt, who left a memoir, my great-uncle, Eric Feldt, who left an oral history with the State Library of South Australia and his book, The Coastwatch. And that was about his early life, the one with the State Library in South Australia. And I also wish to thank my aunt, Mrs. Brenda Tate, who is the family historian and is here today with my uncle, Edward Rye. Okay, before I begin, from my personal knowledge, can I have, by a show of hands, how many people knew of the Coastwatches before becoming aware of my talk or my book? Oh, that's a very good number, yes. And how many people had heard of Eric Feldt? Yeah, a few people, okay. So, it seems to me that the words spoken by Mark Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the evil that men do lives after them, and the good is oft interred with their bones, could apply to Commander Eric Feldt, except his ashes were scattered into the sea off Madang instead. Very few Australians have heard of Commander Eric Feldt or of the unique and vital way he fought for Australia in World War II. Commander Eric Feldt, Augustus Eric Feldt, OBE, 1899 to 1968, was the leader of the Coastwatches of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands in World War II from 1939 to 1943, and the author of the book, The Coastwatches. He was my great-uncle, but I never met him. He was not really talked about a lot in my family, but as a child growing up, I knew it was special that he was the leader of the Coastwatches, whoever they were. As a young adult, I read his book and was impressed, but had difficulty following all the military happenings. However, I've learned quite a lot about him in recent years, and I'd have to say he was quite a talented individual. He was reserved and modest, but his abilities shone through. He was intelligent, athletic, and also possessed leadership skills. He was patriotic, hard-working, caring, determined, and had a good sense of humour. There's so much to say about him, it's hard to fit it into one talk, but I've chosen what I think is most relevant. This is a picture of Eric as a boy. His story began with his birth in Ingham, Queensland on the 3rd of January 1899 to Swedish immigrants Peter and Augusta Feldt. His life was to lead him to become the head of one of the most successful spy teams of men and one woman. This is a picture at his family home with his sister Lucy and Ada and his father Peter in the background. Ada was my grandmother. His parents owned a sugarcane farm and employed 2 South Sea Islanders. Eric learned to speak their version of Pidgin, as well as English. His mother, Augusta, known as Gussie, decreed that her children would not speak Swedish, only English, the language of the country in which they lived. At 12 years of age, Eric was successful in the scholarship exam of 1911. The scholarship award meant he was able to board at Brisbane Grammar School in 1912. During that year, he was selected as the only Queenslander from 6 candidates in Queensland to be accepted into the very first Australian Naval College, which commenced in 1913. selection was determined by ability. Vice Admiral Peter Jones has written an excellent book called Australia's Argonauts about this first intake, and this first intake was called the Pioneer Class. At the Naval College, Eric's leadership skills came to the fore. He was often cadet captain and also captain of the successful rugby team. It was here that he met his classmates Rupert Long and Hugh Mackenzie, who would figure prominently in his later life. His best friend was John Collins. So Eric is second from the left. That's Eric. Rupert Long is on the end of this row. Hugh Mackenzie is fourth from the end, and John Collins is next to Hugh. This is a picture of the Feldt family in 1914 when Eric was home on holiday. So starting from the left, we have, oh, okay. Oops. So we have Mabel, Emma, Peter, Eric, Gussie, Ada and Lucy. His parents moved to Brisbane in 1915, and from then on, Brisbane was the place he returned to when he was coming home from the Naval College, the Navy or New Guinea. Eric graduated as a midshipman in 1916, which made the papers in Queensland at the time. This picture from the Brisbane Courier, it's the 20th of January 1917, has the caption, "First Queenslander out of Jervis Bay RAN College, now on his way to England. Youngest son of Mr. and Mrs. P. Feldt, Clayfield, late of Ingham, North Queensland." Eric served in World War I. Leaving Australia in early 1917, he sailed to England, where he initially served on the HMS Canada in the Grand Fleet in Scapa Flow off Scotland. It was cold and lonely, and the fleet saw little action. At the end of the war, he had to wait for a passage home to Australia, so he attended an intelligence officer's course in Greenwich, and so that was his main thing to do with intelligence. In February 1920, he was graduated as a lieutenant. In 1922, Eric left the Navy and was replaced on the retired list. From 1923, Eric was employed by the Administered Service of the Australian Mandated Territory of New Guinea, which included New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, and Buka and Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. He started out as a patrol officer, leading patrols into the jungle and even into headhunter territory. This is a picture of Eric on the Sepik in 1924 with his crew. He rose through the ranks to become a district officer and eventually became warden of Wow Goldfield. He married Nancy Lynette Eklund, a social journalist with the Brisbane Courier in Brisbane in 1933. And soon after, they sailed to Madang for Eric to take up his appointment there as district officer. In 1935, he had a brush with death when he became critically ill with both scrub typhus and malaria together. He needed all his fighting spirit to survive these life-threatening illnesses. After his illnesses, he applied for and was appointed warden of Wow Goldfield. This is a picture of the Wow town before the war. So in his 17 years in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Eric learnt the lay of the land, and he gained the respect of the expatriate Australians and the Indigenous people. In April 1939, with talk of war in the air, Eric transferred to the Navy's emergency list. When war came in September, he re-enlisted. The Director of Naval Intelligence was Rupert Long. Commander Rupert Long knew that Eric, his friend from Naval College days, was the man he needed to extend the existing small coastwatching service of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Coastwatching in Australia was begun after the end of World War I by the Australian Naval Board. It was established around the coast of Australia so that in war, suspicious sightings could be reported. It relied on responsible civilians such as customs officers, missionaries and postmasters. They were supplied with a code and used landline telegraph for reporting. However, much of the coast was not covered. To the northeast of Australia, the islands of Papua New Guinea and the Solomons and what was then known as the New Hebrides formed a chain almost like a fence. There are only a few coastwatchers scattered throughout these islands. Commander Rupert Long wished to remedy this, but it was not until August 1939 that Cabinet advanced finance. There was no telegraph in the islands, but radio communication was well developed. Eric flew to Melbourne in early September 1939 to gain knowledge of coastwatching from Rupert Long and his civil assistant, Walter Brooksbank. Walter Brooksbank had done much since 1922 to advance coastwatching around Australia. Eric then flew to Port Moresby. His title was Staff Officer Intelligence, and he had the rank of Lieutenant Commander. He was allocated £200 for the cost of his mission. From September 1939, he travelled widely across the territory, vastly extending the existing small coastwatching service. He travelled by sea, small plane, car, bicycle and on foot, recruiting unpaid civilian volunteers to be coastwatchers. He enlisted mainly people who had tele-radios, and the Navy lent tele-radios to others. This is the tele-radio, and they had been developed by Amalgamated Wireless of Australia, AWA, and the most recent model was the Type 3B. It consisted of a transmitter, a receiver and a loudspeaker, housed in 3 metal boxes, 2 feet by 1 foot by 1 foot. Power was provided by a car battery, charged by a small petrol engine that weighed about 70 pounds. In Eric's view, it was a grand instrument which stood up to heat, wet and amateur handling. Because of its size, 12 to 16 carriers were needed to transport it. However, at the time, it was the best and most compact set available. It had a range of up to 400 miles by voice and 600 miles when transmitting by Morse code. Over time, radios became more portable. So Eric taught his recruits coastwatching, gave them copies of the Coastwatcher's manual and taught them Playfair code. Eric was also able to place some naval personnel in strategic close-watching positions. By the end of November 1941, the Coastwatchers existed like a fence across the islands, which could signal sightings of intruders to local forces and to a distant high command. So this is a picture of coastwatching teleradio stations from December 1941 to December 1943. This is taken from Eric's Coastwatcher book and is a combination of 2 years. So some of the coastwatchers in position in 1941 were not there in 43 and vice versa. The question arose about what should be done in the case of an invasion. The coastwatchers, who were naval officers, could be ordered to stay, taking to the bush if necessary. Not so the civilians. The Navy told them they were to bury their teddy radios and escape. Eric, as a forward-thinking individual, privately discussed with many of the civilians what would happen. He told them that their service might be of great value if they remained. Whether they did or not was entirely up to them. That many of them did was out of loyalty to Eric. He had a plan in place for himself in the event of invasion to stay and report from the hills behind Port Moresby. However, the Coastwatch's headquarters, as part of Area Combined Headquarters, moved to Townsville in May 1941. His rank became acting commander, and Eric's title was changed to supervising intelligence officer. Eric was delighted when his friend from Naval College day, Hugh Mackenzie, joined him. Hugh had also retired from the Navy and re-enlisted. He had spent the intervening years in Papua New Guinea. Hugh was the ideal person to eventually become Deputy Supervising Intelligence Officer and to help Eric. When war came to the Pacific, many of the Coastwatchers did end up behind enemy lines, and Eric's responsibility for them increased drastically. Their spying had reached a new level. So this is a picture of some Coastwatcher huts. Other huts were smaller and hidden more deeply in the jungle. In 1942, it was a unique situation, surviving as a Coastwatcher in the steamy, disease-ridden jungles of Papua New Guinea and the Solomons, and spying on the Japanese and sending out the vital messages by teleradio. For Commander Eric Feldt, there was no precedent on how to lead, support, provide provisions and to place Coastwatchers in the optimal position for observing the enemy without them being discovered. Being caught would have meant likely torture and certain death. That they managed to survive against great odds was a real tribute to their bravery, intelligence and sacrifice. The support and loyalty of the Indigenous population was an essential part of their success. Eric pushed for his Coastwatchers to be given military standing, which would provide them with recognition, an income and a pension for their widows should the worst occur. In April 1942, civilian Coastwatchers became members of the Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve, RANVR. This is a picture of Ferdinand the Bull. Okay.
Oh, that's my headband.
That's right, so very appropriate for today. I thought so. Well done. So Eric gave his organisation the code name of Ferdinand from a children's book by Monroe Leaf and a Disney movie, a short cartoon movie, about a bull, Ferdinand, who did not fight but sat and smelled the flowers. It was to remind the Coastwatchers it was not their duty to physically fight, but to gather information as inconspicuously as possible. However, they were fighting, not with guns or bullets, but with their eyes and ears and tapping fingers and voices. If unfortunate to be physically attacked, they could fight back. Well, here is a group of Coastwatchers. Eric and Hugh are in the centre. So there's Eric and there's Hugh Mackenzie. As Coastwatchers became sick or exhausted, they needed to be evacuated and replaced. Civilians from Papua New Guinea were taken into all three Australian military services, and with servicemen not from Papua New Guinea, especially commandos, were trained in coast watching. At first, the training was in Eric's small office. So he had this small office as a back room in the Commonwealth Officers Building in Townsville. Eventually, other training centres were set up, including Chabragalba near Beaudesert and the House on the Hill near Cairns. While his leadership was essential in overseeing the activities of the Coastwatchers, Eric was more than an armchair soldier. He was very much a hands-on participant. As a practical man, he was used to achieving what he set out to do, and he was quite frustrated at times by the slowness of the Navy and the Army. So he led him to do other things. Some of these were, he sourced parachutes from a Townsville sail maker and helped to pack them. Parachutes were needed to drop supplies to the Coastwatchers behind enemy lines. He went as a guide in a Catalina flying boat to search for a Coastwatcher in danger behind enemy lines, which he probably shouldn't have done given his position as leader of the Coastwatchers. He oversaw the fit-out of HMAS Paluma, the Coastwatch's small ship. So this is Paluma being fitted out in Townsville. You can see Castle Hill in the background there. And so they fitted it out with an aerial for the radio and guns, so it was all set up to go. And he led a team on Paluma on a reconnaissance patrol to Woodlark Island in no man's land, not knowing if it was occupied by the enemy. Fortunately, it wasn't. He also visited the Coastwatch's base on Guadalcanal near the battle zone. While Eric Feldt was remarkable, he was indeed fortunate to have a team of many remarkable people and brave people. The Coastwatchers made many significant contributions in what has been called the Battle for Australia. So in January 1942, due to radio silence from Rabaul after they had been attacked, Eric asked Coastwatcher Keith McCarthy to investigate the aftermath and the fate of the Australian soldiers who had been stationed there. So this is a picture of Keith McCarthy and Connell Gill. So from February to April 1942, Keith McCarthy, Blue Harris, Hugh Mackenzie and Connell Gill and other Coastwatchers rescued about 360 Australian soldiers who had been deserted by the Australian government and would have perished without the actions of the Coastwatchers. In May 1942, sightings of the Japanese warships by Coastwatchers Jack Reed and Donald Kennedy in the Solomon Islands forewarned the Allies and aided our preparations for the Japanese invasion of Tulagi and the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea was pivotal in the war, for it stopped the Japanese landing troops at Port Moresby. In July 1942, Coastwatchers Don McFarlane and Snowy Rides sent messages that the Japanese had nearly completed a vital airfield on Lunga, on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. If the Japanese were able to build this airstrip, their planes would be in easy reach of Port Moresby. This would have had dire consequences for Australia. So, in August 1942, the Allies were propelled to bring forward their invasion of Guadalcanal, and they landed there on the 7th of August. The Japanese weren't about to give up easily. 4 hours after the attack began, they sent a squadron of bombers from Rabaul to fight back. However, Paul Mason on Bougainville, this is Paul, he spotted them and he sent the message, 24 torpedo bombers headed yours. This gave the Allies, especially the planes from the aircraft carriers, the time they needed to be prepared. A very small number of Japanese bombers made it back to Rabaul, and very little damage was done on the Allied ships and landing party. At 9 a.m. the following day, Jack Reed, this is Jack Reed there, further north on Bougainville, warned of 45 Japanese dive bombers approaching Guadalcanal. So again, our planes and ship and boats were ready. So the efforts of Mason and Reed helped enormously to ensure the Allies' August invasion was successful. In mid-August 1942, Hugh Mackenzie set up the Coastwatchers Battle Zone base near the airfield, which the Americans had taken over building from the Japanese on Lunga and Guadalcanal. The Americans called it Henderson Field. While the US Marines and pilots and soldiers battled over many months to hold Guadalcanal against repeated Japanese attempts to regain it, Mason and Reed and other Coastwatchers in the Solomons continued giving vital warnings of planes flying over and ships sailing down the slot, which was the nickname for the sea passage in the Solomon Islands. In so doing, the Coastwatchers greatly helped the Allies to be able to hold and eventually defeat the Japanese in Guadalcanal. They were like a human version of radar, only better than radar. In November 1942 in New Guinea, Lyndon Noakes sent messages about the Battle of the Beachheads. So the Japanese were trying to sneak in the back door there along the Mambari River. Noakes reported each new location, bombing of locations, stopped the Japanese sending their troops and supplies to the beachhead. And in November 1942, Coastwatch's ship Paluma marked a safe passage from Milne Bay to Boona, allowing small ships to carry tanks, cannons and heavy artillery needed to defeat the Japanese who were dug in Boona and the beachheads. So overall, it was the Coastwatch's early warnings of planes and ships and troops which gave our allies such a huge advantage, because forewarned is forearmed. In particular, it was essential for Allied planes to be in prime position in the air ready for the enemy planes, rather than being sitting ducks on the ground or on aircraft carriers. The Coastwatchers also rescued many people apart from the 460 Australian soldiers. There are about 450 civilians, 320 airmen, 280 seamen, including future President John F. Kennedy, and large numbers of Indigenous people. All Coastwatchers played an important role. There's some I'd just like to highlight, and some I've mentioned already. So that's better? Okay. So, Coastwatchers I'd like to just give a little shout out to. Hugh Mackenzie, who was Eric's deputy, and Keith McCarthy, who led the soldiers, and James Connell Howard Gill, who was Eric's able assistant and who helped Keith McCarthy rescuing the Australian soldiers. Connell Gill was a Brisbane solicitor before and after the war. He was also a good friend of Eric after the war. And Paul Mason and Jack Reed, whose messages helped save Guadalcanal. And Indigenous Coastwatcher Sergeant Uwicka, seen here receiving the Loyal Services Medal. And Ruby Boy, the only female Coastwatcher. Fortunately, Ruby was several hundred miles away from the battle zones. However, she sent out much needed weather reports and when needed sent on messages from other Coastwatchers. So this is a picture of the Coastwatchers base at Lunga, and you can see there is a deep trench running along the road, so they all had to dive into that when the planes came over. Coastwatching was going well. So in March 1943, Eric went on a planned visit here to Guadalcanal to see Hugh Mackenzie and the Coastwatchers at their base at Lunga. And as I said, the Coastwatch was going well. He left on the 20th of March 1943 aboard a small seaplane. While in the air, a severe pain gripped Eric's chest. The pilot flew him to Tulagi, where a doctor at the Naval Hospital diagnosed a coronary thrombosis or heart attack. Although Eric's heart attack was serious, it was not fatal. Enemy air raids were still happening in Tulagi, while he spent a month in the Naval Hospital there. General MacArthur requested Eric's return by Catalina to Brisbane. Sadly, the adverse effects on his health put an end to his leadership of the Coastwatchers. Commander James McManus took over as head. So this is a picture of a Catalina, Coastwatchers and supplies. So Eric had really devoted his heart and soul to help save the Pacific and Australia. And what was most difficult for him was the heavy responsibility to ask and order his men to stay in this enemy-infested territory and to send men into the field. Many were men he knew personally and counted as friends. The majority had been civilians prior to 1942. Eric knew full well what demands he was putting on them by sending them into infection-riddled jungles where the Japanese might hunt them down and torture and execute them. This happened to his best friend, Alan Fairley Kyle, known as Bill. This is a picture of Bill Kyle from World War I. All things considered, it was not surprising that the stress and strain and workload resulted in Eric having a heart attack, but it would have taken an extraordinarily strong man not to be deeply affected by what had happened and what he had tried to do. Australia was fortunate in having this right man at the right time to achieve what he had. and fortunate that he also lived to write the story of the Coastwatchers. As the war continued, the Coastwatchers became un-Ferdinand-like, and with local native people, they conducted guerrilla warfare, killing about 5,400 Japanese. However, the contribution of the Coastwatchers was mainly in intelligence. It was 80 years ago, in 1942, in the dark days when the Japanese had the upper hand in the war in the Pacific, the Coastwatchers' activity was vital in getting the balance of power to swing the Allies' way. Without the Coastwatchers, the fight would have taken much longer and a greater number of people would have lost their lives. US Fleet Admiral William Bull Halsey said, "The Coastwatchers saved Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal saved the Pacific." In the New Year's Honours list in 1944, Eric was ordered the OBE, British Empire, Order of the British Empire. This was to be the only reward he received. No official honour or recognition of his outstanding service was made by the United States. During his recuperation in Brisbane, Eric filed an official report about the Coastwatchers and began writing his book on the achievement of the Coastwatchers. Eric's book, The Coastwatchers, was first published by Oxford University Press in Melbourne in 1946. Reviews in Australian papers were positive. So this is one from the Mirror, Western Australia, Perth, on Saturday the 19th of October. Unsung Australian heroes defied outwitted Japs. And this is what they said. Commander Eric Feldt has not dramatised their story. His book is factual and well illustrated. Here is a story of Australians who deserve to live in the memory of their fellows. Every schoolboy and girl should read it and marvel that the moment found such men. So this is a picture of Eric's first edition, the dust cover there, and also a picture of the French edition, which was published in 1964. It's perhaps more eye-catching and perhaps a more appropriate title. So Eric ensured that his first edition was a tribute to the Coastwatchers. It is an excellent book. It's got 53 glossy photos and 6 maps. His writing shows his talent for prose, but also his ability to play both humorous happenings and the serious, sad and factual military events. He lists the names of the Coastwatchers in the back of the book. They number about 408. 90 were in the field. About 400 Indigenous men also were part of the team. Eric did not, however, include much in his book about himself personally. After the war, he worked as secretary of the United Service Club in Brisbane in 1946 and 47. Then his health gave out again. In 1954, Fleet Admiral William Bull Halsey came to Australia. On his visit to Brisbane, the Courier Mail reported he said of Eric, "I could get down on my knees every night and give thanks for Commander Eric Feldt." In 1957, a lighthouse memorial was constructed at Madang. Eric and other Coastwatchers had taken part in helping raise funds from the public for half the cost. The Australian government provided the rest. It is a wonderful monument, but it's not in Australia. Eric and Nancy were there for the opening, and he unveiled the plaque which bears the names of 36 fallen Coastwatchers, and he laid the first wreath. The monument bears the inscription, "They watched and warned and died that we might live." In 1960, the US presidential candidate, John F. Kennedy, was a World War II hero who had been rescued in the Solomon Islands in 1943. Attempts to find his rescuer had not succeeded. The identity was thought to have been a Lieutenant Wincote of the New Zealand Army. When no such person was found to exist, a search was on to find the real rescuer. An article in the magazine Pacific Island Monthly caught the attention of Eric Feldt, who sent a letter to the editor saying from the location it could have been Lieutenant Arthur Reginald, known as Reg Evans, of the Coastwatchers. From there things progressed and Reg received his full recognition and a meeting with President Kennedy in the Oval Office in the White House. Eric and Nancy lived quietly in Chelmer from 1946 to 1965. Then they moved to a unit in New Farm, Roseview, on the corner of Brunswick Street and Oxlade Drive. He died there of a heart attack on the 12th of March 1968. At his request, he had a no-fuss funeral at the Mount Thompson crematorium. In May, his ashes were scattered ceremonially into the Pacific Ocean off Madang near the Coastwatchers Memorial Lighthouse. So Eric Feldt and the Coastwatchers are not exactly unsung. There have been many books written about them and by them. They have forever, however, been forgotten by Australian history and Queensland history. Until 5 weeks ago, I would have said there are no memorials specifically to the Coastwatchers in Australia. They are better known in America. However, recently I had a look at Feldt Street Park in Moorooka and found that part of the sign, the lower part, is about Commander Eric Feldt and the Coastwatchers. But Feldt Street Park is quite tiny and Feldt Street is small, and it's not on a main thoroughfare, it's out of the way. However, it is still nice that there is a street and a park named for Eric. There is a park called Coastwatcher Park at Trinity Beach in Cairns. The pictures on the website don't show any memorials. Somebody who is trying to promote the knowledge of the Coastwatchers is 99-year-old Coastwatcher Jim Burrows. With the help of his son Robert, he has a wonderful website called The Last Coastwatcher. This is dedicated to keeping the memory of the Coastwatchers alive. It is a great website to visit. There is another Coastwatcher alive. He is Dixie Lee. He's no relative. And he is 98. Over the past couple of years, I have been trying off and on to find a way for there to be a remembrance or even a mention of the Coastwatchers in our Anzac Square and Memorial Galleries here in Queensland, in Brisbane, without success. It seems that a simple brass plaque in memory of them on the wall of brass plaques in the World War II section could be a possibility. However, that possibility has been very difficult to achieve. At this point, I might be in with a chance to get to first base, but we'll have to wait till January next year, 2023, to find out. On the upside, Macarthur Museum has recently added a display plaque for the Coastwatchers, which, while not permanent, is special and for which I feel very grateful. It is well worth seeing. Eric's medals have been on display there on loan from the Royal Historical Society of Queensland to where he bequeathed them. Having taken part in 2 world wars, naturally has a good number of service medals. I believe it is a shame there's no military award from the United States of America. I'll end with this talk with this portrait of Eric, painted by Norman Carter in 1957. It is housed in the collections in the Australian War Memorial, but not displayed. It is my sincere hope that the Coastwatchers and Eric Feldt will become better known to Australians in the future, and that their bravery, sacrifice and vital contribution to the war in the Pacific will receive the recognition I believe they so rightly deserve. They are true heroes, lest we forget. Thank you.